Welcome to the deep dive. What if everything you thought you knew about right and wrong, good and evil, even guilt, what if it all had a history you never imagined?
A history rooted in things like power, resentment, debt, maybe even a kind of sickness.
Exactly. That's what we're diving into today. We've got some challenging sources lined up, mainly Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality, plus some related notes.
Right. And our mission really is to unpack these, well, pretty radical ideas about where our deepest moral feelings actually come from.
And maybe see what they reveal about us, right now.
Let's do it.
So let's just jump straight in. The text immediately takes aim at some common ideas about morality. It critiques the view that good just sort of originally meant useful, and we all just forgot.
Yeah, he calls that kind of thinking pretty unhistorical, like it misses the real story.
So what's the alternative presented?
Well, the source argues there isn't just one type of morality, there are actually two basic types, completely different origins. He calls them aristocratic morality and slave morality.
Okay, two types, aristocratic and slave. Let's start with the first one, the aristocratic kind. What does the source say about how that began?
Well, this perspective suggests good was first defined by, the powerful, the ruling classes.
For nobles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about altruism or being helpful to others, not at all. It was purely about them.
About themselves.
Right. Good just meant noble, powerful, maybe wealthy, truthful, like the warrior type. It was all about their own sense of superiority, a kind of self-celebration.
Oh, so it's like they look at themselves and said, yep, this is good.
Pretty much. A self-affirmation. And bad. That was
Yeah.
just everyone else, the common folk, the low, the simple, an afterthought, really.
So good, defined from the inside out by the ones who felt superior. That's really different.
It is. The source calls it the pathos of nobility and distance, that feeling of being inherently better and separate.
Pathos of distance.
And it gives examples like the Greek nobility or maybe the German word gut being linked to godlike. The point is their good is primary and bad is just a weak contrast.
Okay, that's the aristocratic view. So how does the second type, the slave morality, emerge? Because that's where we get evil, right?
Yeah.
Which feels much stronger than just bad.
It does. And according to the source, this slave morality comes later. It's born directly out of resentment.
Resentment.
Yeah, like a deep-seated bitterness and impotence felt by the weak, the oppressed, against those powerful aristocratic types. And unlike the aristocrats who start by saying yes to themselves, the slave morality's first creative act is to say no.
No to what?
No to what's outside itself, no to the powerful, the nobles. It looks at them and says, that is evil. That's its starting point.
Wow, so evil is defined first as a reaction against the powerful.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The source really hammers this difference between the aristocratic bad, which is almost dismissive, and this slave morality evil, which is full of, well, hatred.
So evil is everything the aristocrats valued. Power, strength.
Exactly. Power, wealth, maybe being godless from the perspective of the oppressed. And only after defining the powerful as evil does this morality define itself as good.
Which then becomes the opposite.
The opposite, the wretched, the poor, the weak, the suffering, the humble, they become the good. It's a complete flip. The source calls it the transvaluation of values.
A transvaluation. Like turning values upside down.
Totally, initiated by the resentment of the weak.
And the source uses the Jewish people as a major example of this, doesn't it? Daring to reverse that aristocratic equation.
Yes, it portrays the Jews as this priestly nation of resentment par excellence. It sees their revaluation as this incredibly significant, world-changing historical act.
And it even makes a connection to Christianity.
It does, quite provocatively. It suggests that Christian love, in a way, grew out of this deep Jewish hate as its kind of triumphant crown, a complex and definitely controversial point in the text.
So just to summarize that bit, one morality is self-affirming, starting from good. The other is reactive, starting from defining evil.
That's the core distinction. The aristocratic type acts spontaneously, overflowing with power. The slave type needs an external enemy to react against. Its action is fundamentally reaction.
The source even notes a difference in how they view their enemies.
Yeah, it suggests the noble type is almost too careless or forgetful to really create a detailed caricature of their enemy, while the resentment of the weak leads to, a much more poisonous and distorted view of the evil ones.
And this whole dynamic, this clash of moralities, the source claims it's had huge consequences. It talks about the dwarfing and leveling of the European man.
Right. It sees that as a huge danger, a trend towards mediocrity and making people more, inoffensive, comfortable, but less grand.
Less potential for greatness.
Something like that. This perceived mediocrity is linked to the victory of these reactive instincts, the slave morality, which the text sort of frames as tools of civilization that tamed the older, wilder, aristocratic ideals.
And it contrasts this with figures like Napoleon.
Yeah, seeing Napoleon as this kind of late, complex, maybe even problematic embodiment of that aristocratic ideal trying to reassert itself.
Okay, that's a really challenging take on good and evil. But the source keeps going, right?
Right.
It looks at guilt and duty through a similar lens. And the origin it proposes for ought or duty is unexpected.
Oh, definitely. It argues that this core moral idea of ought, of duty, doesn't come from some lofty place. It comes from something really basic and material.
Okay.
Oh, as in owing a debt.
Like financial debt.
Exactly. The source traces guilt. The German word should means both guilt and debt back to the ancient relationship between a creditor and a debtor.
Okay.
And punishment in this early stage wasn't about making someone feel morally bad or deterring others. It was simply compensation for the unpaid debt.
Compensation. How? What did the creditor get?
The right to inflict pain. A kind of satisfaction. The source is pretty blunt about it, talks about the delight in cruelty, the joie de faire le mal pour le plaisir de le faire, the joy of causing harm just for the pleasure of it.
Wow, that's dark.
It is. And the text insists that ancient people weren't ashamed of this cruelty. It was just part of life, expressed quite innocently in its view.
So, crucially, this punishment wasn't meant to make the debtor feel guilty in our modern sense, like
Right.
internally ashamed.
No, the source is emphatic on this. It claims that genuine remorse was rare, and punishment often actually prevented the feeling of guilt from developing. The debtor just saw it as bad luck, a disaster, part of the deal for owing, not because they did something intrinsically wrong.
So it was external, not internal.
Right, more like, well, I couldn't pay, so this happens, not I am a bad person because I couldn't pay. The text even mentions Spinoza's idea of conscience as just sadness about a bad outcome.
Okay, so if punishment for debt didn't create our deep-seated feeling of guilt, our bad conscience, where did that come from? That internal knot of wrongness?
Ugh. Now, this is maybe the most famous and unsettling part of the argument. The source claims the bad conscience was born when humans were forced into society. Forced into peace.
Forced out of the wild.
Exactly. All those wild instincts, aggression, cruelty, the joy of attacking and destroying, they couldn't be discharged outwards anymore. Society put walls around them.
So where did they go?
They turned inward, against the self.
Turning violence against oneself, that sounds awful.
It's described as terrible. Man, this animal being tamed, starts attacking himself, beating against the bars of his new social cage. He lacks external enemies, so he becomes his own enemy. He creates this internal torture chamber,
Wow.
persecuting himself, gnawing at himself, frightening himself.
Wow.
This internalized aggression, the self-attack, according to the text, is the origin of the bad conscience. A sickness, really. Man suffering for man.
That is incredibly bleak.
It is.
Doesn't the source also suggest something else came out of this, something we might see as...
Yes, that's the twist. This horrific process of internalized cruelty, this self-torture, paradoxically, provided the fertile ground for things like idealism, selflessness, self-sacrifice. They're presented as later, more refined forms of this same cruelty turned inward. The energy is still there, just channeled differently.
Huh.
And the source even links this to the origin of gods. The debt owed to ancestors grows and grows, becoming unpayable, eventually leading to the idea of an all-powerful God before whom humanity feels utterly guilty and unworthy.
And the Christian God is singled out.
As bringing about the peak of this guilt consciousness, making the debt, the guilt feel infinite.
Okay, so we've got these alternative origins for good evil and guilt bad conscience. The text then tackles ascetic ideals, right? Like poverty, humility, chastity. Why do people embrace self-denial?
It explores this, starting with certain types of people, like philosophers. For them, the source suggests asceticism might not be about inherent virtue, but more like a practical tool.
A tool for what?
To escape torture, basically. The irritations of the body, the distractions of the senses, the noise of the world, things that might get in the way of intense thinking.
Like a way to focus.
Exactly. It uses Schopenhauer as an example, suggesting maybe he needed enemies like sensuality to keep his mind sharp. His asceticism was like a balm, helping him function intellectually.
So for the great thinker, it's a condition for their best work, not necessarily a moral achievement in itself.
That's the argument. Poverty, humility, chastity for certain powerful minds, these aren't ends in themselves, but means to keep their dominant intellectual drive clear, to curb other instincts like pride or sensuality. Their desert isn't virtue, it's the necessary solitude for thinking.
Okay, so that's one perspective on asceticism, but then the source gives it a much broader and maybe less positive meaning when it looks at society as a whole.
Yes, definitely. It argues that the sheer power and prevalence of the ascetic ideal across history points to something else, something more fundamental and maybe worrying.
Which is?
That man is fundamentally the diseased animal.
The diseased animal. Ouch.
Yeah. And in this view, the ascetic ideal isn't some higher calling, but rather springs from the self-preservative instinct of a life that's already weakened, declining, or exhausted.
So it's a defense mechanism.
Kind of. A dodge, the text says. A strategy used by this weakened life to keep itself going, to fight off total collapse or disgust with existence.
So wait, it's not actually life-denying. It's life-preserving, but for a kind of sick life. That's a paradox.
That's exactly the paradox the source highlights. It suggests that the sick, the weak, the botched, the suffering are actually a danger. They resent the healthy and the strong, undermine trust in life itself.
And they seek power.
Yes, but through crooked paths, the text says, aiming for a kind of subtle tyranny over the healthy. It even mentions the sick woman as a sort of archetype of this will to power operating through manipulation and refinement.
And where does the ascetic priest fit into this picture?
The priest is the herdsman for these sick souls. His key function, his great utility, according to the source, is to redirect their resentment.
Redirect it where?
Inward. Instead of letting their hatred explode outwards, he channels it against themselves using concepts like sin, guilt, damnation. The message becomes blame yourself, hurt yourself.
This sounds like a pretty devastating critique of religion's role.
It's certainly presented that way. The source argues that the priest's remedies, things like inducing states of reduced consciousness or providing frameworks like sin to justify emotional turmoil, actually end up making the sick sicker.
How so?
Leading to things like shattered nervous systems, maybe even what it calls delirious death cravings. It contrasts the perceived lack of good reading in some religious literature with the perceived health of ancient Greek texts.
Okay, and then comes perhaps the most surprising turn. Science gets drawn into this critique of the ascetic ideal. How does that work? Science seems like the opposite.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the source argues that modern science, especially its relentless will for truth, is actually the final, most refined form of the ascetic ideal, even if scientists don't realize it.
How can the will for truth be ascetic?
Well, think about it. The absolute faith in truth, with a capital T, the suspicion of the senses, the focus on objectivity often involving a kind of detachment from the messy, lived world. The source sees all this as grounded in the same fundamental faith that gave the ascetic ideal its power. The belief that truth is the highest value, more valuable than life itself, perhaps.
So it shares the same underlying value system.
That's the argument. And physiologically, the source suggests this intense focus might also rely on a kind of impoverishment of life, a certain frigidity of the emotions, similar to other ascetic practices.
So even the drive for objective knowledge could be problematic in this view. A symptom.
Potentially, yes. Science can become a hiding place, the text suggests. A refuge from other difficult aspects of life, maybe a place for a bad conscience, or for those who lack a great life-affirming ideal.
And it ends that section with a real cliffhanger.
Right. When this will for truth finally turns its questioning gaze upon itself, when we start asking why truth is so valuable, questioning the value of truth itself, that's the moment, the source claims, that morality as we know it begins to crumble.
A profound challenge. Now, we also looked at some fragments from Nietzsche's notes, Peoples and Countries. How do they connect?
They seem to apply some of these core ideas about values and truthfulness to culture and politics. For instance, contrasting Michelangelo, seen as grappling with creating new values, with Raphael, who is portrayed as merely glorifying the old ones.
And it brings up the problem of truthfulness again.
Yes, framing it as a distinctly modern problem and using it to critique various figures, Bismarck, Wagner, even Plato and Kant from this angle, suggesting that our very capacity for doubt can become a problem itself.
These notes also contain some pretty blunt assessments of different nations, particularly the Germans.
They do. The text calls the Germans dangerous, skilled inventors of intoxicants, meaning big ideas, maybe like idealism or nationalism. It criticizes a tendency towards Philistinism, bad taste, and valuing force over character. It's quite harsh.
And contrast them with others.
Briefly mentions Italians having a kind of Republican distinction and artistic sense, yeah.
And politically, what's the stance in these notes?
There's a clear disdain for politics based on just keeping the peace and letting things drift, peace and laissez-aller.
Okay.
It argues popular representation, parliaments are inadequate for the future's challenges. It calls for representing great interests and for strong leadership.
Stronger than democracy provides.
That seems to be the implication. It dismisses national politics as untenable and finds Christian influence in politics an embarrassment.
There's also that mention of a united Europe.
Yes, presented as the only really significant political task for the future and suggesting it would need Napoleonic-style methods to achieve it.
And then there are those really controversial parts about race and international alliances.
Absolutely. The notes contain these, frankly, inflammatory suggestions about German Slav intergrowth, the role of Jewish finance, aiming for world mastery, and aligning with Russia against England and an American future.
And it's crucial to state we're presenting these ideas because they're in the source material, reflecting its specific and often disturbing perspective.
Yeah.
Not as endorsement.
Critically important clarification, yes. The overall thread, though, connecting back to the morality critique, seems to be a concern that modern European developments, while maybe making people safer or more predictable, are leading to a belittlement of human potential.
The mediocrization again.
Right. The triumph of herd virtues at the expense of qualities needed for perhaps greatness or profound transformation. Man becoming the stable, predictable herd animal.
So wrapping this all up, we've taken quite a journey through some really challenging ideas. How concepts like good and evil might have origins in power and resentment.
How guilt might stem from debt and violence turned inward.
And how ascetic ideals, even the pursuit of truth itself, could be viewed not just as virtues, but as complex symptoms, tools, or even dangers related to the health of life itself.
And we've seen how these philosophical ideas were connected in the source material to critiques of modern culture and politics, warning against a kind of leveling or mediocrity.
It leaves you with so much to chew on, doesn't it? What really stands out to you after revisiting these texts? Is it just how unsettling the proposed origins of our deepest values are?
That's certainly part of it. The idea that morality itself, or at least certain forms of it, could be seen as potentially harmful is, well, it's radical.
Or maybe the paradox that finding meaning even in suffering seems to be a fundamental human need, even if that meaning, like the ascetic ideal, is framed by the source as ultimately hostile to a flourishing life.
That's a huge point in the text. The ascetic ideal, for all its criticisms, is credited with giving meaning to suffering, saving humanity from utter nihilism, from the void of meaninglessness. But then there's the final twist, that the relentless will for truth, born partly from that same tradition, might now be undermining the very foundations of meaning and morality it once helped build. If our search for truth leads us to question the value of everything, including truth, what's left, what comes after morality begins to crumble? That's the big open question the source leaves hanging in the air.